Now, as I said, we've got an amazing lineup of speakers today, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is the wonderful Rebecca Hilsenrath. Now, Rebecca, I think you will know, she's the Chief Executive of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and she's going to be talking to us about how EHRC strategy is responding and adjusting to new challenges. Rebecca's got an extraordinary life story. She was appointed Chief Executive of the EHRC in October 2015, before which she held the role of Chief Legal Officer. She's a Cambridge graduate and also practiced law at Linklaters. She then worked in the Government Legal Service, where she held another number of roles in the then Department for Education and Skills and the Attorney General's Office. She was then appointed CEO of Law Works, a national charity facilitating free legal advice to community groups and individuals in need, where she worked for 5 years before moving to the EHRC. So Rebecca is absolutely steeped in the issues that we are addressing today, and she will be speaking for 20 minutes, and then I hope that we will have a chance for questions. So, Rebecca, over to you.
Thanks so much, Nita. I've never been called wonderful before. I think you're wonderful too. I think you're even more wonderful. I'm going to share some slides. I'm going to try to. Yeah, there we go. I hope everybody can see those. Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Nita. It's phenomenal and quite humbling actually to be part of an array of such exciting and high profile speakers. And I know it's going to be a really good day for JED. So thank you very much for including me and for arranging this occasion on, as you say, it's such an important time. So a few words first about my organisation. I think the 3 words I would choose would be freedom, justice and compassion. And that is what we are there to stand up for. Our jobs are to protect and promote human rights, to enforce equality legislation. We believe that if everybody gets a fair chance, then we all thrive. We're a GB organisation. We have offices in London and Manchester, but also in Wales and in Glasgow. We have a dual role as the country's national equality body, but also a national human rights institution. And I'm talking to you 10 years after the Equality Act 2010 came into force and 20 years after the Human Rights Act came into effect. And these pieces of legislation have never been so important as they are today. The Equality Act was a consolidating piece of legislation, so bringing together 116 previous regulations and acts of parliament and bringing up the legislation across 9 protected characteristics, which affect life across work, employment, education, transport, and other areas of life. And frankly, is regarded as a bit of a global standard in equality legislation, especially given the number of protected characteristics which are embedded in it. Human Rights Act, as I think you will know, is the legislation that brings into domestic legislation the fundamental rights and freedoms in the European Convention of Human Rights. And I think it's fair to say that we have a very proud tradition in this country of equality, from equal pay to equal marriage. And those values are going to be incredibly important as a foundation right now. If you look at the narrative of human rights, they were born out of the dreadful events of World War II, when we saw what life was like without any framework of fundamental rights at all. But the Human Rights Act, as I say, came into effect in 2000, just before 9/11, and therefore a lot of the narrative of that legislation in this country has been against the background of terrorism. Now it's about a different kind of death. It's about the right to life in the face of coronavirus, but also the balance of other fundamental rights, like family life for those in care homes, right to education, and so on and so forth. Fundamental rights endure. The issue really is the context, the narrative against which those rights are enforced and relevant. So, moving on to the impact of the pandemic. When we first started talking about coronavirus, and it's hard to believe that a year ago I didn't know what corona was, we talked about the fact that it didn't discriminate, but there's a big but there are stark inequalities here. And the most vulnerable people in our society have been most affected by it. Both the virus and the impact, the financial impact of the measures taken have shone a light on entrenched inequalities, a double whammy for some who've suffered both most from the virus and also most from the financial situation. Times of great pressure on resources, there's always a concern about where that pressure will be brought to bear, and often it's on particular groups. Bertrand Russell once said that collective fear stimulates herd instinct and tends to produce ferocity towards those who are not regarded as members of the herd. Anecdotally, I was in Wales during lockdown, and I used to hear locals talking about how English people had bought all the toilet paper from the co-op, which is kind of funny, but kind of not. And I think it's that kind of othering that we see in terms of great stress. At the EHRC, we've been working really hard. And in fact, that's been a story of the nation. People are either underemployed or overemployed, but everything about this pandemic comes into our remit in terms of equality and human rights. We've been focusing on access to basic services like food, and we've been focusing on protecting and upholding people's human rights. For some groups for whom it's hit harder, they were people who were finding life difficult already. And frankly, it's quite terrifying how I think people can slip into poverty and destitution, even in this country in 2020. And we stand to risk the gains that we've made in equality over the past years. This is most likely to impact on the young, on ethnic minorities, on the disabled, and we stand to lose a whole generation. A study that came out a couple of days ago, you may have seen, said that for the first time, a global study of, I think, 5 million people showed that more people than not were dissatisfied with democracy, which is actually quite terrifying. And it makes you wonder, actually, exactly why younger people at the moment should, in fact, give their trust to governments. Equality and human rights need to be integrated into the policy response. We need to build back better. So, responding to the pandemic as an employer, and pre-pandemic, of course, we were making steps towards more inclusive workplaces with good progress, but some way to go with significant barriers still there for some people. Gender, ethnicity, and disability pay gaps were remaining quite stubbornly wide. There were barriers for ethnic minority groups, for older people, for those with caring responsibilities, including parents. And we saw a lot of workplace harassment. The Me Too movement, which Nita referred to earlier, our own piece of work, Turning the Tables, which shone a light on this. We cannot let this crisis exacerbate those problems. We need an urgent action. We need a coordinated response. Our commission produced guidance on how to stay within the Equality Act while responding to Corona, which was very popular, downloaded by a lot of organisations. It provided a lot of general information about compliance and about good practice, some specific stuff about reasonable adjustments for disabled people, and how to support pregnant women. 4 key principles on the screen. Don't take decisions based on protected characteristics. Take into account the needs of individual employees. Communicate with your employees. Record your decisions. Track their impact. Audit is really important, particularly as we are now, I was going to say heading into the second wave, but I think in the second wave, difficult decisions being made. So ask yourself, who's been placed on furlough? Who's been made redundant? Who's been asked to return to the workplace? Who's gone on unpaid leave? How many reasonable adjustment requests have been requested, and who has been offered flexible working patterns? Tracking this information is really vital. That's how we're going to be able to offer mitigation where it's necessary. And it's how we prevent this disproportionate impact in difficult times. As always, data is king, or queen, depending on your preference. So, reducing inequality in terms of pay gaps. As you know, the enforcement of the requirement to publish gender pay gaps was paused this year, given the particular situation in which employers found themselves in March, just as lockdown came in and we were heading into the deadline for reporting. But that doesn't mean to say that action to close gaps should be halted. In fact, we've seen in the light of the Black Lives Matter movement, again, that Nita referred to earlier, household names like Zurich and BP are actually voluntarily declaring their ethnicity pay gaps, which is great role modelling. And we'd like to see that taken up by more organisations. The EHRC has been calling for quite a long time for mandatory reporting for both ethnicity and disability pay gaps, as well as gender. And there's a real need to have robust action planning once that data is available. We need to be measuring recruitment, retention, and progression alongside remuneration. And we need to have once we've got that detailed analysis of what's behind the figures, we're then going to be in a position to be able to address any discrepancies. Employers should be publishing the narrative. They should be publishing an action plan with time-limited targets, which is informed by the analysis that they've undertaken. So moving on, I talked earlier about harassment and abuse. This has been often in the headlines the past couple of years. It's been seen to be endemic, and it's not gone away just because people are working remotely. At the start of the year, we produced detailed guidance for employers, asking them to think about how they prevent, how they tackle harassment in the workplace. If you haven't had a look, have a look now. Look at your policies alongside that guidance and ask yourself if you're doing what you should be. When we work, we believe that we have most effect when we use our various legal powers together, and sexual harassment is an instance of how we've done that, because last year we issued a call for evidence, issued a report, published a report on the back of that, undertook a number of strategic cases, undertook some enforcement work. You may remember the President's Lunch issue. We drafted and produced guidance, and we've called for a change in the law. We believe it's time to bring an end to non-disclosure agreements. The government has made some quite positive noises about that. Like many things, Corona has intervened. But in the meantime, we believe that progressive and sensible employers with good values should not be using them anyway. You also know from the headlines that there's been a surge of domestic abuse during the pandemic, and this is because, of course, people are shut up at home with their families and sometimes with their abusers. One route to help has always been through the workplace, and that is harder if you're working remotely, but it still doesn't quite go away, and it's quite easy to believe that this is going to happen to somebody else's workers and somebody else's employees, but actually the stats say it's happening to yours. We worked with the CIPD on producing guidance on how to manage and support people in that situation. This is not about solving their problems, and we're not saying that that's your job, but you are in a position to recognise warning signs once you've looked at that guidance and trained staff, and then you're in a position to try to get help for people who may be depending on you. So lots of fairly negative stuff there and lots of doom and gloom, but it isn't just negative, and there are opportunities. Again, Nita said this at the beginning. This has been an extraordinary opportunity for many of us to combine our careers with our responsibilities and our engagement with family and friends. On a personal note, my father, who has Alzheimer's, lives with me, and I have actually found this to be quite challenging, but actually very rewarding and much easier to care for him while carrying out my job, working from home full time. He may wander in the course of this talk, I hope he doesn't, but that's actually been quite a rich experience for me and for my team and my family. What we've seen is flexibility. We've seen communities coming together to look after each other, and that has kept our society and our economy functioning even in the worst of times. We've seen a huge expansion of every kind of flexible working, and this has happened overnight. It's been scaled up, it's been rolled out without bureaucracy, without having to make complicated, long, difficult business cases, and we've proved that it can work, and there's that lived experience there. And I've seen diehards who said, well, it can't be done, my job can't be done working from home, and they've had to eat their words. We, for quite a long time, have had a call out for flexible working to be a day one right at all levels of any business by default, unless a business case can be put forward. And we think that that's been amply justified and vindicated by what's happened during the pandemic. Greater choice creates greater inclusion. We all know that, and that's true particularly for women, but also for disabled people, and frankly, for most of us. And this has been an opportunity for us all to bring our whole self to work. One of my greatest joys is that when I'm on a call with people, and somebody's baby is crying or someone's dog is there, we don't do what we used to do, which is pretend it wasn't happening and pretend that we're two completely different people. That person in the office who doesn't have a home life and doesn't have a dog or a father or a baby, but rather you are who you are regardless. And if somebody's baby cries, then the meeting encompasses that somehow and goes on. And there's an authenticity to that I think people have found really important and valuable. That stuff's going to help with everything, and it's going to help with pay gaps as well. I facilitated a seminar recently on the new normal, which I know is the kind of buzzword. And one of the people on the panel said something that I've really taken away. It's very valuable to me. And she said, there's going to be stuff about the pandemic that we want to give back, and there's going to be stuff that we want to hold on to. The key thing is that has to be a proactive choice. If we don't make a proactive choice, we will slip by default into what used to be the bad old ways. And we need to see what innovation has brought us and make a really proactive decision to say, actually, that's the bit I'm holding on to. And I think that's true for us in our personal and our professional lives. So finally, towards recovery, because of course, that is where we're heading and that will happen, although life is not going to be the same. This was a seismic shift, generational event, and we're not going backwards, we're going forwards. But a fairer and more equal society did come out of the Second World War and other things as well going further back. And that must be where we set our horizons and we set our sense of direction. We need a whole business approach. And I know that other speakers today will talk about how they're doing it, and we need to learn from them and learn from each other. Look at your supply chain. What are you doing about procurement? Where are equality and human rights in everything that affects your business? Are you fully meeting the needs of different customers or different clients? And do you understand what those needs are? Are you taking positive action in recruitment? Are you building a pipeline of diverse talent? Are you looking at opportunities through apprenticeships? And are you taking your expertise into the wider community? Because I think there's a role for business front and centre here to promote equality and inclusion in the wider world. Business leaders are role models. There is a real leadership opportunity and obligation here, which goes beyond your immediate teams. It's really important to set targets, to be clear and to be measurable, to be positive, to open eyes to a better future, because there is no going back. We can and must take up the opportunity for what is going to be fairer, because we know that what is fairer is also better, stronger, and more resilient by definition. The pandemic has opened our eyes both to the inequalities in our workplaces and society, but also the possibilities for a better future. And for Corona to make any kind of sense, if it possibly can, in the light of the enormous losses that society has suffered, we need to find a better way forward out of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. We're very grateful for that. There were some points you made and of talking about othering at times of great stress, which seems to me to be a really important insight representing the danger that we face. And, othering somehow, it's not that othering gets minimized in normal times, but it's easier to pass it over. It's when it's up there kind of front and center at times of stress that it becomes very dangerous. And as you said, the threat to democracy. You also talked about the need for an end to NDAs and the secrecy that surrounds some of this. And also you talked about the dangers of domestic abuse. But the point that you said that really, really struck me was your point about the needing to audit, right? This is not a time to, firstly, not a time to take the foot off the accelerator, but it's also a time to make sure that the organizations are aware of actually what is happening. And the thing that you said about the danger of a disproportionate impact on particularly minority groups really struck home with me. Can you say a little bit more about what you would like? I mean, a year from now, there will be some kind of new normal. What would you like to see at that point? What were the differences that you'd like to see?
Thanks, Nita. I suppose one of the advantages of being a commission that looks across both equality and human rights is that ability to sort of draw out basic principles in terms of how we work. And I'm completely aware that this is a largely private sector event, and I don't know how many people from the public sector are here, but I still think that there are some quite interesting lessons to learn across. So the public sector equality duty, which in this country is binding on public authorities, is all about ensuring that you've got the data to be able to understand the impact of what you do, both on your employees, but also on the community in terms of the functions that you have, the public-facing functions. Human rights framework, on the other hand, has certain basic pillars that involve things like participation, engagement, listening to people. And that's kind of, I suppose, what I mean by audit. It slightly comes back to pay gaps, really. But unless you really understand what the numbers are, what the impact is, unless you evaluate what you do, you're always going to be fighting blind, because you're not really understanding the sort of value added, the difference of what you're doing has made. And that's, frankly, we talk about this a lot to both public and private bodies, and it's absolutely basic stuff for any kind of policy development. We're simply saying it applies within the equality space. If you want to make a difference to people's lives, you've got to have that audit trail. And I'm not just saying that from a legal perspective. Obviously, anybody who's concerned about, I'm sure nobody here is concerned about being in breach of the law. And if you are, you want to defend yourself from a discrimination claim, you need to have your audit trail. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about understanding the impact of what you do, setting yourself very clear objectives. The great thing about a gender pay gap analysis is that not that you end up with a particular figure and you say it's 6% or it's 12% or whatever it is, but you understand where the problem is. Once you say to yourself, well, this, the gender pay gap is just an example, but once you say to yourself, this is the profile of my organization, there's nobody coming in at this level, or the highest paid people are all the technicians and they're all blokes, whatever it is that you find out, then you say to yourself, okay, well, how am I going to address that? And I'm going to have a very clear and specific objective that helps me to get there. And just to end up, it's just an anecdote, but one of the really interesting examples coming out of gender pay gap work a couple of years ago was EasyJet, who carried out, I don't know whether anybody from EasyJet is around, I know they're going through a difficult time, but they carried out a gender pay gap analysis and found that they had a really, really high gender pay gap. I think it was about over 50%. And the reason was that they had 1,500 pilots, of whom 1,400 and something were men. And funnily enough, they paid their pilots more than they paid anybody else in the organisation. And so they set themselves a very clear target. By date X, they will increase their women pilots by proportion Y, which I think was 20%. And they were going to put in various measures to make that easy. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Understand the numbers, put clear objectives, make sure they're measurable and time bound. And that's it feels quite easy and simple, but that's the essence of it.
So you said that this is a time of danger, but also a time of opportunity. What sort of feedback are you getting from your networks and your stakeholders about what's actually happening on the ground at the moment? Are you, what are you hearing about, which side of the pendulum of danger and opportunity we currently stand?
So I'm a natural optimist. So you have to take everything I say with a huge pinch of salt. I have heard amazing stories of organizations transforming themselves overnight into places where a lot of people find a fulfillment in being able to undertake caring responsibilities and work from home. And it's been a complete delight to welcome an extraordinary innovation and flowering of talent, of people understanding how you can do things differently. But I think that comes at a real cost and a real danger. So obviously, we have to recognise that we have diverse workforces and they react to home working in different ways. Many younger people are actually working off ironing boards in cupboards because they don't actually live in a nice big home with a nice big garden. They don't have a dedicated workspace. And we've seen a massive escalation in mental health crisis, which, where there's real concerns that can lead to damage that, needs to be looked at on a par with COVID, what's happening to our younger people. And organisations, all organisations where people are working from home, need to understand what they can do to support people. It's not enough anymore in this day and age, and I'm not being disparaging. I'm sure people are doing a great job, but it's not enough to kind of put in a call once every 6 months or to have a monthly newsletter. We really need to think about how we're supporting people through a difficult time. Our real concern, one of our major concerns, is about the impact on harder hit groups. We published a report this week looking at the impact of corona across various protected groups. If people are interested, they can download it from our website. But particularly we're looking at disabled workers and minority ethnic workers, where, as I say, they were closer to hard times before, and these people may very well be pushed closer to destitution. And lastly, certainly anecdotally, there is concern when companies have to make difficult decisions, and we know that these difficult decisions are probably still yet to come because government support hasn't fallen away yet. There's a sense, isn't there, of sort of treading water and waiting for the bubble to burst. But there is a real concern, and it comes back to that point you started off with, Nita, about othering. Unfortunately, poor behaviour happens in times of stress. When everyone got loads of money and loads of opportunity, then everybody benefits from that. But if you have to make a hard choice, are you going to get rid of the pregnant woman? Are you going to get rid of that woman with 4 kids who quite often has to take a day off because there's something wrong with, her child who may be disabled or whatever? And I think that those are going to be difficult decisions and difficult times. A lot of that's anecdotal at the moment. That's why we put out the guidance that people need to go into those difficult times, remembering that we need to protect people who are having a hard time.
No, absolutely. Have you managed to do a look at what's happening internationally in this context? Because, much as some people may not like it, we are part of an interconnected world. And there are examples of what's happening internationally, which, we might find helpful. Have you had in the midst of all of this, have you had the opportunity to have a look at what's happening internationally?
So it's not our major focus. And by the way, hello to Trinidad and Tobago. We work domestically, and our remit is domestic. Our focus internationally is very much a sort of, if you like, a sort of peer support focus. So we belong to various international networks. And in fact, we chair one. We chair a network called the Commonwealth Forum of National Human Rights Institutions, which enables us to understand what's going on amongst our fellow national human rights bodies. But I have to say, that's normally quite a humbling experience. As I say, we do have a solid protection of laws in this country, and we are very privileged in many ways in terms of the battles that we have to fight. So looking across the networks, I would say that we work quite closely with international comparators generally. During the pandemic, I'm not particularly aware of specific learning, but it's something that we do work with closely in terms of sharing expertise and broadening our networks to understand what's going on in other places. And of course, like most people, we've found that the pandemic has brought a great opportunity to be able to connect more easily with stakeholders from abroad.
And just following up on that, the sense of that has been good practice. We, our organisation and the CIPD, we've been working together to really demonstrate that actually, for example, line managers who've absolutely been thrust in the forefront here, because they were able to look after teams of 10 or 20, if many of who were kind of sitting in front of them. Now suddenly, at a day's notice, they've had to really understand the individual requirements of each individual member of the team. No 2 people are the same in this context. And for some managers, it's been very difficult because that's, that they've been, as it were, process managers rather than people managers. But on the other hand, I think it is true to say, and I think one has to give credit here, that there's been a fantastic flowering of how people have been relating to each other under these difficult circumstances. And our very strong sense is that in a period of 6 months, that we've sort of crashed together changes that might have taken 10 years to happen. And a lot of them have been very positive. Now, now that we're in it for the long term, this is, a question, but how do you think we might be able to disseminate some of this good practice?
So I absolutely couldn't agree more. And now you're playing into my desire to be a glass half full person. I think that, I mean, to be absolutely honest, I think that, you know, if you've got a really good team and they're incredibly good at their work, and you're managing them, it's often, you know, not challenging. The challenging bit is managing difference. It's managing diversity. It's managing remotely. It's managing flexibly. It's all the things that people have actually been challenged to do. And yet you're right, you've seen an enormous flowering of talent and innovation, which is great. I'd like to particularly mention how we have been able to connect effectively and well with people across the country, which has made us challenge the way we travel, the people that we choose to talk to. It's made us think about where we get our information from, whether it's previously been too close to home, whether we can connect with partners further away, and critically, you know, where we employ people, you know, people who live in those hard to reach areas and who don't have the opportunities. You know, that ability to reach out and benefit both your organisation and the individuals is going to be critical. And a lot of that plays into the work that we're trying to do in the sort of levelling up agenda, how we talk to people around the country about how we can look at inclusive growth, create opportunities for harder hit groups, you know, across the country. But in terms of the actual question you asked me, which I was going to answer, and I can't remember what it was, about how we
can sort of pull together good practice.
I think we absolutely have to keep talking to each other. You know, we run a group at the Commission called Working Forward, which has pulled together a lot of organisations and employers across household names, but you know, but also smaller ones, which look at what is good practice. What does that look like? What are the problems? How do we solve them together? I think talking to each other is critical, and I think that actually we've proved during the pandemic that we can be much better at talking to each other than we used to be. And because we've all managed that reaching out piece, and because it has been effective and it has been rewarding, we need to do it in this space as well. And I think the conference here is a great example of that, but it's about how we share the learning.
Yeah, and just one a kind of final sense from you. Your point about networking with other organizations and making sure, I mean, one of the things that seems to me to be absolutely critical at this time is that everybody that's got, as it were, a finger in this pie, for whom this stuff really matters, really does we need to get our acts together and network around this and be very clear what our priorities are going to be. Because one of the dangers is that big organizations, you know, who do try and do the right thing at you know, always will, you know, are sort of slightly ahead of this agenda. The danger is that tail of SMEs and other organizations where the practice perhaps hasn't been as good, we've still got a huge challenge about how we reach them at a time when a lot of them are just going to be anxious about staying in business. So I think that, you know, we do need to work with people like the Chambers of Commerce and the Federation of Small Businesses to really make sure that this stuff does not fall off the agenda, just in the context of how difficult life is going to be. Look, Rebecca, it's been fantastic to hear from you. Really, really thought-provoking. I will take that phrase, othering in times of great stress. I mean, it was one of those things when you said it, it just kind of banged in my head. And I thought, yeah, that's a really, really profound insight. So listen, thank you very much indeed for giving up the time and for taking the questions. We're very grateful to you, and we will obviously stay in touch on all your details and the work that you're doing, which is so valuable. So thank you very much indeed, and see you again soon.
Thanks, Nita. Good luck for the conference.